Good afternoon, everybody. It looks like we're ready to go. So thank you for joining us on FreshEgg, Fresh Thinking Live 8, and thank you for joining us on our live webinar. Today we're going to take you through the topic of how to prevent a website migration disaster. Website migration is one of those topics where it's often believed that all bases are covered and what can go wrong. Well, more often than not, a few probing questions later and the plan may not seem as robust as first thought. There are different levels of migration. Examples range from merging content to full website overhaul, changing and improving taxonomy, or a full infrastructure change. All need careful consideration. After all, what would be the financial impact should a mistake be made? But don't worry, we're here today to share some thinking with you in the next hour, which we hope you find of use. And joining me today to share their experience of website migrations, we've got 4 experts who each offer a unique perspective of the process. And I'll introduce those guys now. So from client side, we have Sarah Leach. Now, Sarah was once one of our own at FreshEgg, but now is Head of Marketing and E-Commerce at Marshall's Garden. Sarah's recent experience of working with us on a triple website migration and is going to be sharing some of her knowledge of that process from that client perspective. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks.
And joining us also today, we have Robert Belgrave. Robert is CEO of Wirehive. Wirehive are one of our technology partners. They offer an end-to-end solution with hosting and represent some of the world's leading cloud infrastructure suppliers, including AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. It's fantastic to have Robert on board and offer that real technical overview of web migrations from that hosting perspective. And I hope I've got everything there, Robert, but feel free to add any extra there.
Close enough, Lee. Hello, everyone.
Perfect. And rounding off from FreshEgg, I'm joined by 2 colleagues. From a client liaison perspective, we have Account Director Lisa Rippon. Lisa works between client and technical and is in place to ensure we deliver to brief. Lisa worked on the Marshall's Garden migration with Sarah and has worked on a number of other migrations across our client base with Mark and the rest of our SEO team. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi there.
Hello. And finally, but by no means least, we have Mark Chalcraft. Mark is our Head of SEO, Content and Data Services here at FreshEgg. It's Mark's team that predominantly delivered technical support for migrations. So really happy to have Mark share his thoughts on this subject. Good afternoon and welcome, Mark.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone.
Welcome. And for myself, my name is Lee. I am one of the co-founders here at FreshEgg. I head up the products and services team. I get to work with some very clever people, and it's been a bit of a journey having started the business with 2 friends from my spare bedroom over 20 years ago. Now, before we get into the discussion, a touch of housekeeping. If at any time you have any questions, please use the Q&A function within Zoom while the panel are in discussion, and I'll look to get any answers to your questions during the Q&A toward the end of the session. Of course, we're still working remotely, so apologies if any rampant children appear on the screen or at any time there are any bleeps from technology or my father-in-law drops in via Alexa. And of course, if any connection breaks. Hopefully that won't be the case and we're going to have a great session. From my perspective, I feel migration is often taken for granted and the elementary aspects are often overlooked. And we're going to discover this as a progress in the coming minutes. And I think with the introductions done, we're going to kick straight off and move in with Mark. And I'm going to come to you first of all for that overview of, what are those typical reasons for migrating a website?
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, you mentioned a couple, I think, in your intro. I was thinking as we kind of talked about this beforehand that in effect, any time that you change the URL of a piece of content on your website, you have in effect migrated that content from A to B. So in simplest terms, we might be doing those kinds of changes on a regular basis. What we're obviously talking about today is those major projects where we make a significant change to a website and its architecture, potentially even move it to a completely different domain. And there's lots of different reasons why you might want to do that as a business. It could be branding changes. It could be just to freshen up the look and feel of the site or to change the technology platform. We've had projects we've worked on where we have, it's been part of an acquisition, so a business takeover, merging multiple sites. There's lots of different reasons, but typically they would be based on kind of business needs or technology needs.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Mark. And just a question on that. This may or may not be the case, but do you think there are times when corners have been cut and there's not a true understanding of what needs to be achieved from the migration?
I think for sure that does happen. You know, we've seen plenty of instances where that has caused real problems commercially. Certainly in SEO, which is, as you said, the field that I'm sort of more specialist in, that can happen, and there are some specific areas we'll talk about as we go through today that are quite commonly get neglected or shortcut, as you said.
Okay, perfect. And Lisa, if I can come to you, what would you add differently or on top of what Mark has said there with regards to those typical reasons for migrating a website?
Yeah, there are only a couple of things I'd add actually. I think just based on my clients and looking back at some of their reasons for migrating, I think we've had requirements to consolidate international sites. There's often a need to improve site structure and navigation to make information products and services more findable following the migration. I've had clients who've wanted to move to technology that's open source so that they can find people to more readily support that for them. And I've had clients who've wanted to switch to a responsive site to improve their mobile performance.
So quite a breadth of need there from clients at various different times.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting as well, just that no migration's ever the same or driven by the same objectives.
That makes sense. Robert, if I can come to you, I mean, with quality infrastructure, being a key aspect for performance, what advice would you give around that assessment of the infrastructure for those that are thinking around, migration at this time?
I think in the context of like why people move websites, I think if, staying with my lane and talk about technology, is performance, right? Is ultimately the challenge. So I suppose performance and availability, some people consider them to be the same thing, but moving a website technically is challenging and often not obviously commercially rewarding. So if somebody's going to undertake a migration project, they tend to only do so if they're solving a problem, right, from a technical perspective. And so either a site is slow, basically, it's not responding quickly, which ultimately degrades user experience. In the context of selling online, that means that your conversion rate will go down. All of these things can be measured. I know that you guys at FreshEgg are strong on conversion rate optimization. All of the wisdom that goes into that discipline tells you that your site should be as fast as possible, and the faster it is, the more effective it will be, whatever it's trying to do. So performance is one of the first areas that often causes people to kind of undertake the headache of even exploring a migration in the first place. And then the second is availability, because it's all very well talking about conversion rate optimization, but your optimization is, your conversion rate is 0 if your website is down or unavailable. And particularly in the context of paid search and SEO work, people don't talk about this, but a click through Google search to a paid ad, you still get charged for, even if the site that the person lands on is dead, right? So actually this becomes even more prevalent if you're engaging in paid media work or any kind of paid advertising or paid search activity. So availability is the second trigger that often causes people to start to look at migrating. And I think if you begin on that journey, really it's all about planning and making sure that you truly understand what you're moving to. I think that there's so much intricacy to technology, particularly this type of technology around website infrastructure and hosting, that isn't really most people's wheelhouse, right, in terms of their expertise or experience. And often the people that are having to make these decisions typically live in the marketing org of an organization, and you know, understandably aren't necessarily from a particularly technical background, certainly not an infrastructure background. So they can be misled quite easily, I think, by a lot of the ironically by the marketing of technology companies about how great and dedicated their resources might be. So I think the best single piece of advice I could give anybody looking at a migration from a technical perspective is just make sure you've got really great advice, and you know you're working with specialists either within your own teams or, you know, a business like mine or others like ours who are independent to platform, are going to give you a truly objective view on technology, aren't just going to try and sell you the thing they make the most margin on, which of course solves all your problems, and really look to understand that you're getting something that's fit for purpose and that will do the best job it can.
It's a really great answer, and you know, we know that next year we have a UX SEO update coming from Google, and speed and performance is going to be more critical than ever. So you raised some really salient points about the paid media, but 2021 is going to be critical for sites to be as rapid as possible to give that best experience to the users, because you know, every second does count when those users come onto the website. Brilliant. That's a really interesting answer there. Thanks. I think for the next question, we're going to look at the criteria for research and decision making, and what you need to consider in the migration plan and the steps before that. And that's actually coming to that decision and that you need to go through before that migration process. Now, Sarah, Marshall's have in recent times migrated three websites into one. It'd be really good if you could share info and elaborate on how the research criteria you guys put into place and that decision-making process around that.
Sure. So there was a number of factors, I think, that were involved in our decision to migrate the site. So the first one being that we decided to rebrand ourselves. It was quite a long period where we made that decision. So there was a number of things that came into play. Our SEO visibility started to decline, that we noticed over a period of time, which led to an over-reliance on paid search. So budgets from a marketing perspective were increasing, but we were seeing revenue dropping. Our technology infrastructure as well was quite old, and it was a legacy system really. So there was a lot of areas that we couldn't sort of improve on or optimize because of cost, for example, or the technology just didn't exist to enable us to do what we wanted to do. So as part of that process, we put an 18-month conversion optimization program in place with you guys. We went through customer journey mapping, which highlighted a lot of fundamental changes we wanted to deliver for our customers. But ultimately, that decision was to consolidate those three brands into one, to reposition ourselves in the marketplace and to drive operational efficiencies as well. So we're quite a lean team, and running three sites and three brands was very, very resource intensive and expensive. Other things that I think Lisa's also mentioned earlier was that we needed a responsive site. We didn't have responsive technology, and we noticed more and more visitors coming onto the site that were from mobile devices as well, and conversion rate just wasn't very strong from those people. And then other things like we saw improvements that we needed to make in the UX journey through the site, development that we were looking at to try and improve that was really costly, and our legacy infrastructure wasn't very stable. So for example, we had no API integration functionality. So simple things like trying to integrate with our email provider was becoming really difficult. And so we couldn't utilize some of the technology that's out there in the marketplace to do simple things like personalization. Okay,
it's really, really interesting. And with that, and I know that there was user testing that took part on the old website. There was, without giving necessarily away the crown jewels, how did that optimization program help highlight some of the troubles that users were facing, and that you as a business were then sort of blocking users from interacting with you guys?
Yeah. We did some leakage calculations. So we were looking at where potential revenue is leaking from the site. So that was one of the first things that we did. And we noticed that that was coming from the product category pages. As you guys know, typically you would see that the highest leakage pages would be from the checkout flow and the basket pages rather than the category pages. So that sort of rung alarm bells to begin with. When we looked into it further, it indicated UX issues on those pages that the optimization program then delved into. So as an example, we identified our taxonomy wasn't really structured in the most user-friendly way. So we did some tree testing with you guys to help that, and actually we put that in place when we relaunched and saw some real benefit from that. So yeah, that was probably the biggest factor, actually, I would say, that we identified through that research.
Okay, perfect. And one website is tricky enough in that migration process. How did you go about that understanding of what content was working, what you could safely cull, merge, ring fence?
That's a really interesting one. I didn't really know where to start. So we carried out, or you guys carried out, some backlink analysis for us, and we did a content audit. So with the 3 sites, one of the things that I was aware of, that there was a lot of duplicate content. So what we would very often do is publish content on all 3 sites that was talking about the same topic. And again, that was a bit of a waste of resource, and it wasn't really helping us from an SEO perspective either. So we looked at what pages were driving traffic, what pages weren't driving traffic, what pages weren't driving revenue, and then went through that list and decided what we were going to basically cull, what we were going to keep because we felt as though it was performing, and then what content that we thought we should keep but look to optimize for launch or optimize a bit further down the line. So it almost gave us a bit of a content strategy really for the next 12 months post-launch, with a massive program of work. The other thing that we also did, we had done with you guys some search intent work as well early on, which identified a lot of low-hanging fruit, particularly around, rather than product content, meeting search intent in our sector around how to do stuff. So how do you grow tomatoes, for example? A lot of people don't know how to grow tomatoes from seed. It's a very highly searched topic, but there isn't actually a lot of really good authoritative content out there that's serving that intent. So there was certain areas that we identified that we actually created new content for the launch that helped us as well. Perfect.
That's brilliant information. Mark, I've got a quick question for you. I hope it's a quick question. 3 websites into one. In a scenario like this, what are the risks around understanding the taxonomy in that merge and the user needs within that taxonomy?
Yeah, it's a good question. As we said earlier, every project is a little different, but if you have 3 sites which have separate taxonomies, that they're all differently structured, the content is different, potentially you've got different product ranges that you're joining together. The challenge that you face is that you're not necessarily going to have a sort of very clean way of just merging them together. So there's a bit of work that needs to be done there to understand what compromises you need to make, what you might need to prioritize above things that are less important. When it comes to the user needs, you're completely changing the look and feel of their experience with your website. So they might well have a very fixed kind of way of accessing your site, accessing your content, and traveling through that navigation and through their user journey. And that's probably true of any migration. But when you then merging 3 sites into one, the level of change becomes much more. So when you hit that launch button and go live, you are completely resetting the experience that someone will have on your site. So putting that work in up front to understand how do users actually engage with our website now, what are the things that they need the most, and what impact is that change going to have on those things is absolutely critical to doing that. And then as soon as you're in a position to start collecting that feedback all over again, because you need to understand what's changed in that experience, what problems do they now encounter, and there's a huge difference between sort of what we think in theory is the right answer and often what users actually want or what they actually experience can be very different. So it's really important not to take that for granted and kind of rely too much on your own assumptions. Question that continually as you go through the process.
And Robert, just quickly coming to you, and is there anything you would add in that criteria for research and decision making where you would help a business down that path?
I think just include some technical selection criteria in the process. And again, you know, typically people making these decisions are coming at it more from a sales and marketing or commercially led perspective. It's very easy to overlook the key technology criteria that you might want to consider. I mean, the catch-all answer is use the major vendors, use AWS or Microsoft Azure because it future-proofs your decision, and there's a wealth of companies and resource out there that can take on ownership of those platforms for you if for some reason the initial partner you choose or the initial team you have doesn't work out. Typically avoid bespoke products where you can, because again, you're stuck with a small team that builds them if you do that. For example, in CMS selection, this isn't by any means an exhaustive truth, but there are scenarios where bespoke makes sense. But broadly, using some sort of standardized CMS offering from either an open source vendor or one of the paid CMS options that has a large customer base makes a lot of sense. So just think a little bit. I guess my sort of the concise way of saying it is just broaden your criteria a little bit in terms of what you're including when you're doing your research and decision making, and make sure that you do include some technology stuff in there, not just in terms of features and functionality that you need today, but also think about like technical debt in 3 years' time and how that investment will scale in the future as well.
It's absolutely putting that future proofing into it, definitely. Thank you. Sarah, staying with you with this next one. Who do you feel is beneficial for businesses to speak to when making the decision? I mean, you've been in this mix in recent times. For example, we've got devs, marketeers, board, SEOs, conversion specialists. Then you've got key stakeholders within the business. When we talk platform providers, then you've got the technology providers, etc. So there's a lot of people to consult. How did Marshalls go about this particular topic?
I think the key was that we took our time and we made sure that we put enough time into the planning part of it and took our time in making that decision. Probably the first place that we started was talking to key stakeholders and understanding what their requirements were. I think it's really important to take the whole business on that journey and get that buy-in very early on, because you need their support at the end of the day to back your decision, especially if you're asking for additional investment as well, which we were. By doing that, we had the board's confidence in our decision when we got further towards where we was choosing technology, etc. The other thing that I would say was really important that we did was we put customers at the heart of that process as well. So we carried out, which I've kind of already touched on, a lot of research early on. We went through quite an extensive discovery process. Even prior to that, we'd done quite a lot of conversion optimization work as well. So we were building up a picture of what our customers wanted from us in terms of our e-commerce site and the experience that they wanted from us at every touch point, whether that was on or offline, because we had to look at the bigger picture. So we carried out some of that research to identify what their pain points were from us, not just about the whole shopping experience and buying products, but also about what their experience was when they were buying plants in general. So when they went into a garden centre, for example, versus if they went onto Amazon to go and get weed killer, etc., whatever that was. So it was more about trying to get into the mind of the consumer within our sector. We also spent a lot of time talking to different platform vendors. That was possibly the bit that took the longest. and we also involved our development and SEO, you guys, early on in that process as well. I think you alluded to it, Robert. I'm not the most technical person in the world. I can flute my way through some of these conversations, but I do rely on having a really good, solid team behind me to help influence my decision. So that for me was really important. Like, for example, we had a really good solutions architect who helped me understand the intricacies behind all of the infrastructure and how we plug everything together. Because obviously being e-commerce as well, it's a lot more complicated. So you've got things like payment gateways, we've got an ERP, we've got a warehouse, etc., etc. So we gathered a lot of business requirement documents that we pulled together. We didn't go through a really formal RFP process because one of the things that I felt sometimes you can miss from those is the actual chemistry and the people behind the different partners that you might choose to work with. That's really important to me, to make sure that my team have got people they can reach out to that are talking on their wavelength. And we also obviously had, we did a lot of technical requirements scoping and functional requirements as well, obviously. So we didn't rush that. When we got to a shortlist, we actually went back out again and reviewed the market again because we took our time. There was new technology platforms that came to light that we weren't really aware of before. So we did our due diligence and we wanted to make sure that we were keeping up with technology advances as well. So I was really keen to embrace the cloud just to make sure that we were future-proofing our business, really. That was probably quite important to me. And that helped narrow down who we actually ended up approaching.
So I know that the comment you've made is that because of the thoroughness of the planning, that really paid dividends, you know, in terms of the launch of the website. And with that, you came in on time and under budget, which is fantastic. So, you know, a really thorough planning process was just absolute to be able to get to that position at the tail end of the project. And, you know, we talk about that investment there and the upfront work that you did. And that was protracted, but potentially worthwhile process, right?
Totally. I think, like I said, talking to technology vendors, I think we probably spent about 6 months doing that. I mean, all the time we're obviously having to do day-to-day work as well. So it's really difficult to actually find the time to do a migration properly and focus on that and do the due diligence as well and get back to everybody. You also find that you get a lot of salespeople want a lot of your time as well, which can be really difficult to manage. Particularly when the market finds out that you're in the market to buying a new piece of technology, you get a lot of cold calls. So yeah, no, it was totally worthwhile. And I think if you put the time in up front to make sure that you've engaged with all of the key stakeholders, not just internally, but your partners, so your development agency, or even down to if you use any CRM systems, for example, like third-party vendors as well. We have an ERP that's run by a third party that we engaged very early on as well, which was really important just to make sure that it was a really smooth process. It does definitely, in our instance, it paid off in the long run. The migration itself didn't actually take that long. It was actually quite straightforward. That was possibly the easier part in a way.
That's really good information. Lisa or Mark, possibly more Lisa, are there any, or can you recall any cases where it was clear to change not being considered at all levels? And if so, were there any consequences to that?
Yeah, it's in complete contrast to Sarah and the Marshalls migration, actually, but there's one client I can think of, and they were under quite a lot of time pressure to make decisions and also to complete the build. And they decided to rebuild using the same platform as the existing site. As I say, it was driven mainly by ease and cost and time frames as opposed to the suitability of the platform. So I guess that links into what Robert's been saying as well around kind of the technology checklists, etc. up front. But this particular company had undergone new ownership, and with that came a requirement to expand into multiple regions and also to migrate quite a lot of brands into the same site as well. So that new site needed to have its kind of own country portals for each region, which caused multiple issues for SEO, and some of that was URL related, some of it was duplicate content. It was hard to give the correct geo-targeting signals to Google. There wasn't any out-of-the-box solution for this particular platform to deal with any of those issues. So we worked quite closely with the developers to try and kind of find workarounds and kind of do as best as we could to make everything work. As I say, the decision for this particular client was time pressured, but I think had they had time up front to consider CMS providers in a bit more detail, they could probably have ended up in the longer run with a solution that was kind of more efficient for them and easier to manage ongoing.
I think for me, that's one of the clear messages that's just come out of that topic there. Do the research and invest that time into the research, because the results can be disastrous if not. And not so long ago, you know, there was a business that came to FreshEgg for migration support, and what became clear is that there had been perhaps little research being conducted. While we managed to get them through the migration and prevent, you know, traffic disaster from, you know, losing traffic, post live, you know, client team found that potentially a platform choice was not the right fit for purpose, and taking away the pain of migration, you know, the business ended up having to re-platform in a very short timeline. So that research and decision phase that Sarah, you know, you and your team spent so long on, it's crucial, and I think there are a lot of organisations that don't necessarily realise that if you put that effort very much into the formation of the project, understanding what it is that's got to be achieved, you know, the users, the stakeholders, etc., that will pay dividends in the long term, and as well considering that technology aspect, where we're going to be in 2-3 years' time, so everything starts to crescendo together. And Mark, that really brings me on to, you know, the next, and we're going to look at a checklist of requirements, and what we could look at is checklist requirements across all sorts of different topics here. But what advice can you give to anyone that's looking to perform a migration? What are the key considerations from, we look at the SEO perspective and potentially also a data perspective, and what you think should be included within that checklist of requirements?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I think the first thing you've got to do is just be completely clear what you're getting into. So first thing on our checklist is usually risk assessment for SEO, effectively. How much traffic do you currently have? How much do you stand to lose if it goes wrong? What have you got to protect? Because that ultimately is the goal of SEO within the migration, is to get you to a point where the new site's live and you've not, you're in a position to then grow your traffic ongoing. We certainly don't want a migration where huge amounts of traffic is being lost. So you have to do that risk assessment. You know, how much of your revenue and traffic comes from a search engine? What type of keywords are people using to find your site? Are they sort of keywords that include a mention of your brand or not? Because that will affect the risk that that you face. Also, what's the current situation of your existing website? How well optimized is that for search? Because if you have a site that's in really poor condition, and you're moving to a platform that's much better optimized straight away, that has a big impact on how we plan our way through that project and the decisions that we make as we go along. Because again, that changes the risk levels that you face. So it's all about risk, really. You know, how much change is involved, etc., etc. I could go on. Mm-hmm. In terms of the key considerations, you have to, for SEO, and I'll really emphasize this, you have to have someone involved who's got a good understanding of SEO from the beginning. We've had so many examples of businesses come to us and say, oh, we're launching our new site in 3 weeks. Can we get someone just to look over the SEO? And that's a big red flag straight away, because you know that SEO hasn't been considered at all. Sarah talked about not rushing projects. That again is huge. You know, we have businesses come to us and say, oh, we're launching our new site and it'll take 6 months. And we sort of say inwardly to ourselves, no, it won't. It's going to be longer than that. So be clear what you're getting into and do a real thorough job on that planning. For SEO specifically, there's then a lot of different individual aspects you want to look at. One of the key ones is redirecting your old URLs to your new ones. If URLs are changing, that is probably the most critical piece of work you can do for SEO in that sort of short-term launch period. If you don't do it, you are going to lose traffic. And while there's no guarantee that you won't lose some traffic, when you do a thorough job of that, you've got to do that in a really complete way. So we get a lot of pushback from businesses saying, well, that's a lot of work. Maybe we just redirect everyone to the homepage. That's not going to do it for SEO. It has to be one-to-one, old URL to new URL. And I tend to kind of illustrate that by, if you were moving house and you redirect your mail to your new address, well, if you just put your new address down as London, you're not going to receive your mail. And a mass migration of potentially thousands of pieces of content and redirecting everything to the homepage is like redirecting your mail to London when you're doing 1,000 house moves. It's literally that fundamental. But it's one of the things that we get the most pushback on because it is a tedious piece of work, frankly, sometimes. And then depending on the platform and technology that you use and what type of site you have, there's going to be a whole set of SEO requirements. Those are often quite bespoke. So again, have an SEO look at that ahead of time and input into those requirements before you get going on the project proper. Perfect.
Thanks, Mark. And Lisa, in your role as account director, you've worked with clients on migrations over the years. Have there been occasions where that client has suddenly sprung a surprise with moving content, moving website, moving to new technology, and that it needs to happen yesterday?
I had a bit of a think about this in advance, and there were luckily none that sprang to mind, so I just must have quite a good client base at the moment. A lot of my clients have undergone migrations, and I think a lot of the success with them has been that involvement from the beginning. But I think we've already talked about that quite a lot, so I won't dwell on that too much. I think one of the things that I would say in addition is, and there is a client example here, it's always good to have the SEO team on hand when the site launches as well. There's obviously a lot of preparation that goes in terms of putting the requirements in up front, liaising with developers as the process goes on to look at how they've been incorporated in the build and staging reviews, etc. But things can go wrong at launch. So we had one client that actually launched with the no index tag still in place at go live. So obviously they dropped out of the search results pretty sharpish. But we were on hand to spot that had happened and could get that quite quickly rectified.
And that's a big oops, and we don't want that happening anytime, to be fair. No, some good points. One that springs to mind is the governance and project leadership. Now, Sarah, just quickly on this, how important was this during the Marshall's migration, get the teeth in, to have clear leading objectives and avoid that committee culture that can, on occasions, as we all know, derail projects?
Yeah, totally. We had a steering group which was made up of different stakeholders from around the business, and we were really clear from the outset who was responsible for making what decisions. So we kind of split the project up into different areas. We had a UX lead, for example, and they were responsible for signing off any front-end design, and it was ultimately their decision how the site looked, but engaged with different people around the business to make sure that it was on brand, for example. We had a solutions architect who led on infrastructure and the integrations with the different things like our ERP, for example. And then we had a sponsor from the board as well. So rather than it being everybody going, oh, I'm not sure, or yes. Yeah. So yeah, totally. And then we just had like bi-weekly updates, like a status report that looked at key milestones and if there was any risks and stuff like that. So yeah, it's really important. And then tools like Trello and Slack were really, really helpful to collaborate on. I think the key for us was making sure that communication was really transparent and clear with everybody, including third parties as well, because there was multiple agencies involved at different points in the project, so it could get quite complicated. So it did need strong project management, definitely.
Perfect, thank you. And we're going to move on now to a slightly different tack, but still with SEO, but judging the capability of the technology. And Mark, I'm going to come to you with this one. Many platforms do have that SEO friendly badge on the tin, which is not to say is misleading, but how should project owners and decision makers properly judge the SEO capabilities of technology?
Yeah, you're right, Lee. Those badges can often be unhelpful because they often tend to be a little bit superficial. A platform might well be, in basic terms, pretty SEO friendly, but a lot depends on how you configure that and implement the platform. And some will have more advanced technical issues that really do need a level of sort of technical expertise to unpick. A common challenge with e-commerce is that the platforms are creating large numbers of procedurally generated and automated generation of URLs, and that can often be a problem. So again, we talked earlier about getting SEO involved and doing that due diligence. It's well worth, when you're choosing a platform, making sure you know what you're buying from an SEO point of view, and also then having those requirements up front before you start to build, because a lot of it hinges on how your developers actually implement the platform and build out the page templates and so on.
That makes sense. And I think with one aspect that does, I know, sometimes get overlooked is when you're looking at platforms, is to make sure that the team that are going to be working on the site on a day-to-day basis, that they're getting to test the platforms. It's no good with the committee not involving the people on the ground that are actually going to be using the technology on that day-to-day. And again, I have seen instances where the user journey, even on the content management side, has not necessarily been thought through in the right way, which has led to problems. Problems in the amount of time it takes to post content, which of course is money. Time is money, and it works on the other side. Yes, we want a really fast experience. We want to make sure that the user journeys and the users coming on are really well looked after. But there is the flip side, that you also have to have that quick access for your team to be able to deploy changes, make changes, etc. And question I've got in around that, Mark, it's around 301 redirects. Is how important do you think it is for the web teams to have access to be able to make those changes on the ground, so to speak? And does that cause any problems? Are there risks?
So in terms of the technology, yeah, because it can vary by platform, what type of server you have, and Robert would be able to talk to that as well. I'm sure that how those are implemented will vary. In our experience, when we talk to, it's often talking to developers about getting those redirects in place initially, we'll come across different, they have different opinions, they have different attitudes towards it, and different ways they want to go about it. So yeah, it does kind of vary a lot. What you need to do really is again, as I've said earlier, make sure that that's done in plenty of time. Don't leave it to the last minute, because it can be a big piece of work. If you have technology that allows you to kind of automatically import those rules, that can save you a lot of time. But then post-launch, you might need to be able to go back and then adjust certain things if you've missed sort of a few really old pages that just didn't come out in the audit. So you do need a level of access, but depending on the platform you have, exactly how that works is going to vary. So you need to make sure you know that beforehand.
Perfect. Moving on, factors influencing that final migration decision. And Sarah, coming to you, when you were in that melting pot of making that final decision, what were some of those key factors?
Well, cost, obviously.
Of course.
We didn't have a bottomless pit. One of the things that we did to help us understand that was we created a total cost of ownership model. So it allowed us to compare the costs of our current infrastructure versus the technology we were looking to implement, which was really useful. That helped substantiate any investment required up front versus the ongoing return as well. So we looked at it in year 1, year 2, etc. Operational efficiencies was a big one. Like I alluded to earlier, running 3 sites was operationally quite heavy. And we also wanted something that would allow us to automate a lot of our processes as well, because a lot of stuff was manual in the business from end to end, really, in the journey in the back office. We wanted to choose a platform that was well known, and the one that we actually, the technology stack that we chose in the end has got, I think it's something ridiculous, like over 1 million accounts. So it was a really well proven technology. Lots of businesses across the globe were already using it successfully. So it kind of gave us a platform to kind of already step up onto and then build upon. We also had a number of experienced people on the project as well who helped in terms of making those decisions, and their previous experiences of other site migrations helped influence ultimately where we ended up.
Perfect. And key advice for those facing a site migration, you know, because you've been in the thick of it. What advice can you give to our audience this afternoon?
There's probably 4 pieces of advice that spring to mind. I think putting your customers first at the heart of your decision-making process for me, ultimately. You know, at the end of the day, it was all about sort of delivering the best customer experience for our brand, for our customers, and then making sure that we had data as well, and research would substantiate any of the hypotheses that we had or any of our decisions, that just made the whole case for approval much smoother. Involving stakeholders early on in the process is a definite tick. That really helped again get buy-in up front, and also, you know, some stakeholders have got really valuable experience as well that they can bring to the table and help you look at something in it on a different perspective as well, just to make sure that you're actually making an informed decision. Another area that I think is really valuable is going through really robust user testing. I've seen it lots of times where people have kind of skimmed over that. Even in our own business, it probably wasn't something that people really thought was as important. So a lot of the team had never really gone through proper user testing before. And actually a really good way of doing it is coming up with test use cases. And we started to collate those very early on in the project as well. So we didn't leave them to the last minute. And then got lots of different people across multiple different devices to go through that process. So it wasn't just the e-commerce team who were doing that. We even engaged with people like customer services to go through it, because they could buy something on the site in the eyes of a customer, for example. And then probably, it's probably 2 more. Making sure that we had some really strong goals established up front that were really clear, so we could measure success afterwards, post go live, and particularly making sure that we had some commercial goals in place as well, because that helps secure investment. And then probably lastly, don't underestimate the time for integration. I think that was the one area that was a big learning for us. Take away from the project was that we probably underestimated the time that it would take to implement the middleware layer, which was talking to our storefront and our ERP, and probably took twice as long and was probably twice as expensive than we originally thought. So yeah, that was definitely a big learning.
Some excellent points. Thanks, Sarah. And Robert, is there anything that you would add to that at all?
I mean, I suppose I'd probably recap on some of the stuff I've said at the beginning, right? Which is like, whatever decision you make with technology, you're probably going to be stuck with it for quite a while, because change is expensive and complex. So take the time to do the research, pay specialist organizations or hire specialist people to help guide you specifically on your technology choice. Sarah talked about having a fantastic solution architect. It sounds like they were on your team full time, the way you've alluded to. Yeah, nodding. That's always great. That that sort of resource can be found as a consultant as well if it doesn't make sense to have somebody full-time or bring on a contractor for the duration of a project. It pays back in spades and definitely delivers ROI having that sort of resource available to you, particularly in the nature of, if the nature of your project is something complex like e-commerce with multiple systems, warehouse, ERP, etc. But actually, I mean, even to pay someone for a day of their time, if you're doing a fairly basic marketing brochure site, just to make sure you're making good technology decisions, is always worth the investment. We've covered technology selections. We've covered using mainstream products that have wide user bases. I think, yeah, that's probably from the tech. I'm sort of trying to stay in technology, right? But I think specifically in technology, when it comes to these decisions, just give it the time it deserves. Don't make technology an afterthought. So often it's that thing that's like, oh, what about the infrastructure at the end, which invariably lets these things down. Total cost of ownership is a great model. Make sure you include how much it costs to be down for an hour in that model, and factor that into your financial equation for whether it's worth spending an extra £1,000 a month on your infrastructure. Broadly speaking, to be more resilient costs more money, but often it's a false economy not to spend that. Almost as an insurance policy to offset against the disruption it can cause in the worst case. There are so many people out there who run web infrastructure that would be genuinely catastrophic for their organization if it was to fail, who are using equipment or an architecture design that, unbeknown to them, totally feasibly within the service agreement they have, could be down for like 24 hours, right? And they just don't know. And, the reality is most people get away with it because technology is pretty robust. But if you do find yourself in that position, it can bankrupt a business. I've seen it happen. And in other cases, it can certainly cost you your job, those of you that may not own the businesses you work in, and be responsible for these platforms, and cost you the loyalty and repeat business for a number of your customers. So just think about the other sides of the equation. Think about future-proofing the technology choices you make. Think about resilience. Think about performance, and choose. What's the word? Think slowly, right? Like, take the time. It's worth spending the time up front. You will regret it later if you don't.
Yeah, that's really sound advice. Thank you, Robert. Lisa, we're just going to come to this final point before we move on to Q&A. I'm conscious that time is pushing on. It's almost 4 o'clock. I really don't know where those last 52 minutes have gone. But are there any things that project owners need to consider that they don't?
Yeah, I think one of the main things is that a migration is a massive opportunity to optimize for search. I think this can often be missed if the project owner is kind of maybe focusing on other objectives like increasing technology or moving to responsive, etc. So I think it's important to plan this in from the beginning. It's a much more kind of efficient way of optimizing a site if you can get some of those things baked into the build rather than having to kind of come back again and do that later. I think having a development roadmap in place for the build is critical. So something that outlines the key milestones, especially in Sarah's case where there were a lot of third parties involved as well. It meant that we all knew kind of where in the process everyone was and at which stages we needed to get involved. Then I think once the plans and the roadmaps are in place, it's all about just maintaining communication throughout. I think things fall down if people do rely solely on that final staging review, because it might be too late at that point to resolve some of the issues that we may be spotting on the site. And then I think another thing actually is once the site's launched, that's not the end. I think that's often where the plan stops. So it's really important to monitor that site post-live and have measurement plans in place. So you can monitor the impact of the migration kind of throughout that kind of the early stages post-live of the migration to make sure that kind of Google's indexing everything as we'd expect and that the site is regaining visibility in certain areas. But also if you can get down to a more granular level than just overall traffic, you can start to focus in on areas that might need improvement post-migration as well. So it gives you a plan then going forwards of areas that you can continue to optimize and increase performance on. So yeah, that'd be my main ones.
No, it's really good. Thanks, Lisa. And I think that there's some really good information that's come across in those key topics that we've put forward in the last 55 minutes. I'm going to come on to a few questions that have been asked by the audience, some before and some during the webinar. This is quite an interesting one. Let me just do... where are we going to go? What metrics should I be using to measure migration success? Who would like to take that one?
I can touch on a few things there briefly, Lee. You need to be looking at all of the crucial channels individually, and you need to have an understanding of where you were before and track that through. It's quite important, therefore, that your tracking is set up in a way that you can just have a kind of throughput of data without sort of disruption, that you're not having to then take two separate data sets and put them back together again post-launch, which is something we do with Google Analytics for clients. From a search point of view, Search Console is often a key data source for us. That's Google's kind of Search Console. Other search engines have their own versions of that. That will tell us exactly what's happening in Google's results as that change takes place. And Lisa alluded to it, it can take a few weeks for Google, for example, to fully process that change. But we don't know until we do it exactly how long that will take, because every site is different. So yeah, in terms of metrics, it's your kind of Google Search Console metrics, clicks, impressions, average positions throughout, and so on. And then, if you're using Google Analytics, there'll be all of your conversion metrics there, kind of engagement metrics that tell you how users are experiencing your new site and so on. So what you really need is a measurement plan that brings all of that together, so you know ahead of time what you're going to be looking at and you've got the tools in place to do it.
Agreed. And look, we do have a measurement plan which is available on the website. We'll send out a link to that along with our guide to the perfect SEO migration post-webinar. But also on that, you alluded to data, and I know, again, from conversations that we have in office, that there are many businesses that come to us that haven't got an optimal setup of their web analytics, and that causes problem in that migration stage. And it's crucial to have an absolute line in the sand and 100% surety of your data. And I can't stress that enough because how can you measure success if you're not built on that really solid bedrock there? Good. Another question. Is it better to do everything at once, or are there ever circumstances in which you should migrate in stages to mitigate risk? Who'd like to say that?
I mean, I'll jump in. Often, if you can stage a migration into smaller pieces on the technology side, it's favorable to do so. You can offset risk that way and often make it less disruptive to your users. The flip side of that is many businesses actually have windows where, if you're being really honest about it, don't have any disruption associated with them. I'm sure not that many people buy tomatoes at 2 in the morning in the UK, for example. B2B vendors often make this mistake and try and plan migrations in really awkward ways, when actually the reality is nobody uses their tools over the weekend, right? So the best option is to schedule a window whereby you will be unavailable and get it all done in one go. That's the kind of cleanest way to do it. But if you have a business where, or a site or an asset where actually it would be really disruptive for it to be down for any length of time, sometimes breaking it up into smaller pieces can make a lot of sense. That's the tech view anyway.
Perfect. Thanks, Robert. That's a really good answer.
Just add to that, Lee, quickly. Sorry, just going to add to that, following what Robert said, is consider the seasonality as well. You maybe don't want to launch your new site right before your peak season. And I'm always reminded of many years ago, the site that relaunched on Boxing Day, just as the sales started, and the whole site broke and they lost out on a whole ton of money. So that's an extreme example, but consider that as well. Give yourself a chance to overcome any nasty surprises when it's not going to cost you too much.
Okay, I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in. I know we're right up on time. I'm trying to pick a fairly easy question that's going to be useful for the audience. Our current agency messed up our redirects in a recent migration, and our site has tanked. It's lost its SEO visibility. How long will it take to sort out and regain the visibility we have lost? Mark, I think that probably sits in your camp.
I better take that one, yeah. So this is why we say that redirect mapping work and getting those in place up front is absolutely critical, because you can lose that performance overnight when your new site goes live, but it could take you months, a year, a long time to recover that if in the worst case scenarios. That's not to say that we can't recover it. We've done plenty of work with clients in that exact situation where we have been able to restore that visibility, but you're into the unknown with that where Google's concerned, and it's a little bit in the lap of the gods, so to speak. So it can be done, and if you're in that situation, we're obviously more than happy to work through that problem with you. But ideally, don't put yourself in that position in the first place.
It comes back to the theme of the webinar, and it really is planning. If you're going to consider any form of migration, plan 100% correctly and just put that investment in up front, and then you should not come against that type of problem. Sadly, we've come to the end of the hour. Honestly, I don't know where it's gone. My huge thanks to our fantastic panel. Firstly, to Sarah from Marshall's Garden and Robert from Wirehive for their valuable perspectives. Lisa and Mark as well, brilliant, and thank you guys. It's been a really great, informative hour. To finish off, we'll post some links to resources where, we've got hopefully a case study for Marshall's coming out soon. We'll put a link to Wirehive as well in the comms post session. We've got a migration guide, which I've already mentioned. We'll make sure that that's there, the measurement plan, and we've got a blog post coming out shortly as well with regards migrations. We'll be publishing this recording on the website next week. And yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot of questions we didn't get time to answer. We'll make sure that we get those answered on the website as well next week. I hope you've enjoyed today's topic. Do register for our next webinar in October, why UX, SEO and content are a dream partnership for a highly successful website. I think it's going to be another fantastic hour. You can register for this now on the FreshEgg website. Once again, thank you for watching. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, panel.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.